Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to log in, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to join us, and then we'll get started. All right. I think for purposes of time, since we have such an excellent panel with us today, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Attendees who have joined us already, please feel free to use our chat function throughout today's conversation. We would love for folks to introduce themselves as we get started so we can see where you're joining us from and your current role. And also, please feel free to communicate with the panelists and ask questions throughout the conversation. Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Mag, and I'm the Director of Workforce Development Policy for PPI, and I lead our New Skills for a New Economy project. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is in honor of our nation's first ever Youth Apprenticeship Week, which is very exciting. This webinar is done in partnership with the 74, and we are so excited that you all are with us today, and we have this wonderful panel to speak to youth apprenticeship. For very quick background, PPI is a think tank in DC that's mission is to create create and promote bold and pragmatic policy solutions that solve America's most pressing challenges. Education and workforce are two issues the organization is highly focused on. That's why I'm so excited for today's conversation, which is a model at the center of these two systems, youth apprenticeship. Today's conversation will focus on youth apprenticeship programs across the country, how providers are developing these programs, and efforts to scale best practice to ensure more young people have access to these opportunities. Panelists who represent program providers, state policymakers, and national thought partners will also speak more about the impact of youth apprenticeship, how industry is changing their mind on this model, and innovative policy solutions that should be considered by federal and state leaders. This conversation is critically important as it will inform the solutions needed to ensure the U.S. education and workforce systems adapt to meet current workforce needs with a focus on pathways that lead to greater economic opportunity for our nation's young people. With that, I'll briefly introduce our wonderful panel, and then we can get the conversation started. Panelists, obviously, these are quick intros, so please feel free to weave in your past experiences and robust knowledge throughout the conversation today. Our experts include Vanessa Bennett, Director at the Center of Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning at JFF, Latifa Durant, Vice President of Innovation at CityWorks DC, Jess Kulstanek, Senior Policy Advisor for Workforce with Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, and Seth Lenz, Executive Director of the Workforce Development Board of South Central Wisconsin. Thank you all so much for being here with me today and with this great group of folks. Awesome. So with that, let's dive in. Vanessa, I'm going to start with you. Vanessa, you have a national view of the youth apprenticeship landscape working at JFF. JFF is one of the intermediaries supporting DOL's youth apprenticeship expansion work. Can you set the stage for us? What are youth apprenticeships? What are the different ways to define these programs? How are they gaining momentum? And what are some examples of success that you're seeing across the country?
Thanks, Taylor. I think I'm going to take this conversation from sort of the momentum and investment side first, and then I'll talk a little bit about what is this thing, youth apprenticeship, that we're all so excited about. I think we're in a really exciting moment around youth apprenticeship right now. There's so much interest and investment at the local, state, and federal levels to build and scale these programs and really, meet the demand of young people who want to participate in apprenticeship. I think we've seen a really significant number of young people take part in apprenticeship and in youth apprenticeships. And so, I think this investment that we're seeing is indicative of all of our systems and partners wanting to make sure that these pathways and opportunities are accessible to all young people. USDOL, for example, has invested a number of resources through their youth apprenticeship intermediary contracts and grants like Youth Apprenticeship Readiness and Apprenticeship Building America, all of which place specific emphasis on engaging young people and also increasing the important collaborations between career and technical education programs, local school districts, and state education systems that are really essential for building out these pathways. They also recently announced their commitment to building youth apprenticeship pathways in the public sector. And I think that sort of further underscores their desire as an agency to make sure that there are more opportunities for young people created through apprenticeship. And at the same time, we're seeing a number of states take up this mantle and create avenues through policy and grant making to further scale the creation of youth apprenticeship, but also help practitioners and employers build their own knowledge of youth apprenticeship and of the population that this model is serving. And I think, it's just really great for me, and I think for all of us on this panel, to see energy and excitement be backed up by real dollars and policy. It's, wonderful and impactful. And I think that this presents a really unique moment for us to think critically about what youth apprenticeship is. So, you mentioned, Taylor, kind of to talk a little bit about all the different ways that we think about youth apprenticeship. And I think that's a good way to sort of tee up today's conversation, because we don't currently have a codified definition for youth apprenticeship. There are some core components that are universally acknowledged as being essential. That includes everything from connections to registered apprenticeship and career pathways and post-secondary education, to removing financial barriers to college, mentorship, employability and technical skills, as well as support for social capital building and providing industry recognized credentials, right? Those are all things that high quality youth apprenticeship programs are doing and offering to young adults. But beyond that, though, the way that we think and talk about youth apprenticeship is really dependent on the individual programs, states, partners, and in some case, funders that we're working with. This sort of lack of definition or codified definition, it can mean more flexibility, which sometimes is really essential in building programs that respond to young adults and local labor markets and the systems at play. But it can also create challenges in building a cohesive national system. Some of the things that we're seeing in our work at JFF is that without sort of a clear way of defining youth apprenticeship, there's some language barriers, right? And depending on who you're talking to and what programs you're working with, youth apprenticeships might be registered. And in other instances, they're not. Sometimes they're focused entirely on in-school youth. Other times, they're actively seeking to engage young people disconnected from work and education. There can even be discrepancies in the age ranges that are served, some serving only 16 to 21, others serving 16 to 24. And so the various ways in which youth apprenticeship is defined and talked about, it can create some challenges in aligning our state and education systems, our workforce systems, navigating the youth labor law landscape, and even building and implementing those programs. But right now, what we're seeing is a lot of states really trying to define this for, their stakeholders and their communities, and trying to bring some clarity to the model. So I think this is helpful, one, because it definitely gives us a strong sense of how the field thinks about youth apprenticeship. And it also gives us, I think, an understanding of where policy might be going around youth apprenticeship. What it does potentially do is create a dynamic in which, as we see continued growth with this model, we may end up seeing it look different between states and regions. And so I think that's just something to be mindful of. What I will say is that despite not having, one formal definition, there are a lot of really, really amazing examples of programs that are effectively and meaningfully supporting and engaging young people and ensuring that they can access economic mobility. The Charleston Regional Youth Apprenticeships at Trident Technical College in South Carolina is a fantastic example of a 2-year program that's really anchored in a post-secondary partner and brings together regional employers and really connects in with the career and technical education programs in the state. So they're really thinking thoughtfully about how every partner across every system shows up at the table and how they're helping young people in these programs think critically about the education pathways available to them and the training and job pathways available to them. the Urban Technology Project in Philadelphia. They partner with the school district of Philly and offer a really comprehensive IT pathway. And they're doing something really innovative where they've brought AmeriCorps service into the fold to help deliver skills training and work-based learning. And, there's I think so many phenomenal examples, and I know my colleagues in the panel will share some more specifics of the great work that they're doing. But, I think kind of how I want to wrap up this sort of high level context setting is just acknowledging that we're in a moment of, I think, again, real growth, real impact. We're seeing a ton of innovation. And so it's a real opportunity to look at where apprenticeship for young people started, where we kind of, started to see all these partners come together, what we've learned to date, and then really think about where we want to take this in the future and how we want to shape youth apprenticeship so that all young people have an opportunity to access these pathways and benefit from these pathways. And one of the things I'm really hopeful for, and I'm excited to dig into in today's conversation, is to think about what are those policy and partnership pieces that are going to be so crucial in growing youth apprenticeship? And how do we make sure that young people are centered in this and that their voices are really driving the development and expansion of these programs? And I know all of the programs represented here today and so many others out in the field, that's what they're doing. They're really centering young adults, and they're really trying to build programs that don't just meet labor market and employer needs, but meet the needs of those youth. And I think that that's really critical to building meaningful and effective youth apprenticeship programs.
Thanks, Vanessa. I couldn't ask for a better way to kick off the conversation. I thought that was really helpful. I really appreciated you talking about that we don't have, a national definition. So this can really look differently in different states and communities. And also, I really appreciated you talking about kind of who are the young people we're serving through these different programs, in school, out of school, sometimes young adults. The age ranges can be different across programs. So I think that's just really helpful context to kind of as we kick off the conversation. And speaking of successful programs and examples of success across the country, Seth and Latif, I want to pass to you next. Kind of building on these examples that Vanessa just shared, you both are running youth apprenticeship programs in your communities. Can you offer more details about your program model, the partners involved, and the impact you're seeing in the community, and just kind of give us a sense of what's working, what's not, and places that we can continue to look at for growth and change. So Latif, I'm going to pass to you first, and then Seth.
Sure. Thanks again, Taylor. So CityWorks DC operates the CareerWise DC Modern Youth Apprenticeship Program. And as Vanessa alluded to, how folks run their program can vary from state to state, from region to region. And so through our CareerWise DC Youth Apprenticeship Program, we're focused on high school students and recent high school graduates that are beginning to develop their careers in IT, in business operations, and in finance in particular. And so for 2 to 3 years, these young people get to develop the skills and competencies needed to be software developers, HR specialists, financial analysts. While in high school, starting in high school, these students are working for Fortune 100 companies like Accenture and Freddie Mac, as well as small local minority-owned businesses as well. And we are excited to partner with the federal government to hire high school aged apprentices for the first time this fall into the federal government. And so, we see that the impact that we're making with young people in CareerWise is that, when their peers are just going to career services, let's say for the first time to get that first professional job, our youth apprentices already have, 3 years of professional experience under their belts. Our CareerWise youth apprentices are able to transition into full-time employment at the completion of their apprenticeship, or they can go to college, or both. They can go to school and continue to work. And that's why youth apprenticeship really is what we call an options multiplier. By participating in apprenticeship, our young people have options and they know how to access them. But I would say youth apprenticeship is not only for our young people, it's for our employers as well. Businesses are able to develop and train the talent that they need. And to answer, I guess, your question of what's not working, I would say that we have some learnings in our having launched CareerWise DC 4 years ago, that a one-size-fits-all model of youth apprenticeship just doesn't work well. When we started CareerWise DC, we had the apprentices, they were required to be 11th or 12th grade students. And while that works well for some employers and for some students, it didn't work well for everyone. Some employers wanted apprentices to work more hours, and some students found it difficult to manage both work and school. And so we've given our young people and our business partners options. So now businesses are able to choose whether they want to hire a high school student or whether they'd like to hire a recent high school graduate. And it gives more opportunities and flexibility to our young people who are interested in launching their career early on.
And Latifa, before Seth, that was wonderful. And Seth, before I pass to you, I think your options multiplier point is so powerful, that statement. And I was at an event yesterday, got to hear from youth apprentices on a panel. And just to say, literally, there were 3 different youth apprentices and they all were doing different things. They were all just completing their high school, they're graduating high school. One was going to be full-time at where she was an apprentice afterward, not going to college, going to full-time employment. Another had longer time in his apprentice because it was of the trade. So it's a 5-year program, but he was moving forward in that. And the last was keeping on with his employer as a youth apprentice, but also earning his college degree while doing that. So I just think it just shows the breadth of opportunity that's then available to young people. And these were 3 folks in very different fields, but all with expanded opportunity as they left high school. So I think it's very powerful. Seth, going to pass to you to expand on that a bit more and hear about the work you're doing in the Madison region of Wisconsin.
Sure. So a little bit about the structure in Wisconsin. So our program is administered from the state level by the Department of Workforce Development under their Bureau of Apprenticeship Standards. So it is in alignment with the Department of Public Instruction, but it is the funding is still administered through the State Department of Workforce Development. They do a competitive procurement process every year, and so then the different consortiums have to respond to that. Essential elements, as you might expect, the academic partner, so your K-12 system must be partnered in it, students and parents, and then also our employers are a critical element. In Wisconsin, there are 2 options. They can do a 1-year or a 2-year apprentice, so juniors or seniors, and their hours are equal to 450 hours per year is what they need to accomplish as part of that program. They also have to have a related instruction component to that, which is typically the technical college. So that's an opportunity for them to also not only earn their high school credits, but also be earning post-secondary credits in their career. And in Wisconsin, our State Department has aligned these investments that workforce development boards are a required partner to the consortiums. We don't have to be the administrator of them, but the boards are a required partner in that process. For us in Wisconsin, it's a nice alignment of investments, resources, activities, priorities around the local region. So that tends to work good for us. In our region, we have a 6-county workforce development board region, but we're the administrator for our youth apprenticeship consortium, but that's only 2 of our counties, not all of our counties. In our 2 counties, we've been running our program for about 10 years, and we went from a little over 300 participants to almost 1,000 participants for next year. So it's grown significantly. To the previous points, this is excellent for our youth, but it's also excellent for our businesses in our communities. So we've seen some impacts. We've seen a dramatic increase in the utilization of youth apprenticeship as we've seen the momentum build in registered apprenticeship, but it's also been kind of vice versa. There has been some cross-pollination both ways. Industry would maybe have an experience in one, but not the other. And so we've used that as an opportunity to bring them together and be like, well, if you're doing one, why aren't you doing the other? And it's not as big of a stretch as you might imagine. So we're using those industry engagement opportunities to do that shared learning. And I think our businesses have also realized that apprenticeship is a workforce development strategy that is broader than just the traditional trades. We've seen some of our industries like we have IT youth apprentices that are in manufacturing environments. We have industry maintenance that are in healthcare environments. So it's really helped our industries to also look outside of just the traditional pipeline, but then also looking at what's their talent within and how can they create lattices to also build out that career pathway. In Wisconsin, we've also, this I think has also propelled us to really formalize and build out the certified pre-apprenticeship pathway structure. That aligns, again, youth apprentices may go into a pre-apprentice, that then leads to a registered apprentice. But we've also been able to use these certified pre-apprenticeship strategies for those, out of school youth or recent grads that may have not participated in the school program to be able to get on that path. The other one, which I would just plus one, was on the diversity and accessibility. I think that that's probably one of the big shining stars that we're seeing in this, that our industry is really gravitating towards, is we're getting exposure to non-traditional populations, to careers and industries that they might not have had experience with, familiarity with, and then our employers are recognizing that this is diversifying their workforce as well as their workplace from a variety of perspectives, racial, demographics, age, generation. So it's really creating and increasing the dynamic work environment that we're seeing. Some challenges or opportunities for improvement, maybe we should say, would be, is resources. Ours is funded through state legislature, and that's got some limitations on available funds. But as I mentioned, our volume has continued to grow in Wisconsin in the use of this strategy. But I think, as was mentioned, as we want to engage new populations, they're going to need additional supports. They're going to need additional mentoring. They're going to need additional guidance. And I think one of the challenges we have is our program is structured towards juniors and seniors, but that means you've got to have an academic flexibility in your schedule. And so many have compromised their future academic flexibility by maybe some missteps in their earlier academic engagements in the high school arena. So again, that's where I feel like if we have some additional resources and staff to be able to do some of that upstream, it supports the downstream flow. And so I'm hoping that those are going to be some elements for us to continue to work on. But the investments, I think everybody in this workforce development space is learning that we need to continue to braid resources in order to make some of these projects successful. So that's just our next opportunity.
Seth and Latifah, so much you both said in your comments that are amazing. And Seth, a few themes I want to pick up on, and I know we could do a whole other webinar or 3 webinars on pre-apprenticeship, so we're not going to get fully into that today. But I do think that was such a great point on how we do engage out of school youth in these opportunities, and how do we prepare them for youth apprenticeship opportunities and or if it is a registered apprenticeship as well, just so we can ensure that they succeed when they have this opportunity. And I think that's a really important piece of that, and how we do that right is a conversation we should all continue to have. I also just love your point around resources, and especially thinking about mentorship and guidance, not to keep referencing this youth apprentice panel yesterday, but they were so wonderful. And literally all 3 of them said the most important part of their success in their youth apprenticeship program was the mentorship they received on the job, and the ability of either the employer themselves or outside, like an apprenticeship navigator or outside folks, to really help them as they navigated school and work, or also if they were not also in school, just navigate being in a workplace in a different environment. So I think that's such a great point, and would love to get into that a little further today with all of you. So with that, Jess, I want to pass to you. Latifah mentioned CareerWise. This is a wonderful youth apprenticeship model. We're seeing it, it's continuing to gain traction in communities across the country. But Jess, Colorado was the original state or area that started this wonderful program. So I'd love to pass it to you to speak about Colorado's efforts, not only, in CareerWise itself, but also in championing this work for so long. And also if you could elevate some of the recent state action you've been involved with to really advance these types of high quality career experiences for young people across the state.
Yeah, I wish I could speak to the origin stories of CareerWise, but I know Noel Ginsburg would probably do a much better job of that. So we're lucky in Colorado that this was at the top of Noel's priority list for things that he wants to do to intervene in workforce development, youth apprenticeship and apprenticeship. I know some of that work was inspired by the dual education model in Switzerland, and Colorado for about a decade now has had a close relationship with Switzerland in trying to better understand what a dual education system actually looks like in practice. And I think that that has seeded our work in youth apprenticeship and apprenticeship more broadly. And we've had multiple different investments at the state level to bring apprenticeship more to the forefront in Colorado. So some recent examples, apprenticeship navigators. We've started a program around apprenticeship navigators. We created our own state apprenticeship agency, which is authorized under USDOL, which has helped us centralize some of our apprenticeship program processes and really build trust in the community with employers, with sponsors, with businesses, that they can rely on us for their talent needs and that we will produce high quality programming. We have a universal high school scholarship for the class of 2024, which is giving $1,500 to the class of 2024 for either higher education or apprenticeship. So we're having conversations about dual education and trying to position apprenticeship and youth apprenticeship as a viable option comparable to a degree program. We have the governor's most recent RISE distribution, so the Response, Innovation, and Student Equity Education program, which was funded federally. We put $2.5 million of that program toward youth apprenticeship and really trying to grow the ecosystem. But I will say youth apprenticeship in Colorado, or apprenticeship, sorry, more broadly in Colorado, is only 1% of our total workforce. And of that 1%, about 30% of those apprentices are 16 to 24, which I know that the definition of youth apprenticeship is still yet to be determined, but that's kind of the age range that we're looking at. So there's a lot more work to be done if we're going to expand this as a real viable, accessible path for young folks in Colorado. And I think this legislative session, we've put a lot of legislation forward to try to get closer to that vision of a dual education system where you can flow in and out of training and education pretty seamlessly, and they're integrated forces. So one of the big bills that we're running this session, which is on its way to the governor's desk for signature, was House Bill 24-1439. And this bill had three parts. One major component is $15 million annually in tax credits for employers who hire apprentices. And it will offset the wages of qualified apprentices up to $12,600 annually. And what we've been hearing in Colorado from employers, especially the small and medium-sized employers who are taking on the majority of apprentices or who are struggling to break into apprenticeship, we're seeing our large employers carry the lion's share of apprenticeship programs in Colorado. So this is targeted at new and emerging industries and provides additional support to those smaller and medium-sized businesses, because for this to be a viable model, it needs to work across sectors and across business sizes. So we're trying to make sure that people are interested in apprenticeship for their talent needs and that those apprentices are supported. This bill also includes $2 million to support the Scale Up Grant, which was originally a federally funded program that was wildly successful. So we wanted to make sure that the state was contributing general fund dollars to a similar program to seed and develop and scale apprenticeship programs around the state. This also includes $2 million for qualified intermediaries, which is a policy intervention that Colorado is the first to make. And, we have employer and apprenticeship sponsors. I think everyone's familiar with the concept of an apprenticeship sponsor. But making sure that we have qualified intermediaries who can support both the business and the apprentice as they're working toward completion is so important, especially if we're working with younger apprentices. We know that if we don't have those wraparound supports, if we don't have academic supports, if we don't have vetted intermediaries helping them complete, they're not as likely to get there. So that's one piece of legislation we've got working this session. We're also working on Senate Bill 24-104. And this bill actually came out of some work that we did with PIA, so Policy Academy for Youth Apprenticeship, and the National Governors Association. And this policy intervention was really focused on how do we blend CTE with youth apprenticeship? Because one of the biggest barriers to the expansion of youth apprenticeship in Colorado is that it's hard to have a direct relationship with a student or with a young person who's trying to consider their pathway after graduation. But we know that CTE is already really successful and deeply embedded in our public high schools and in our communities. So how do we make sure that an apprentice who is participating in CTE sees a path forward upon completion into an applied program if that's what they're interested in, right? How do we convert CTE programs not just into academic credit, but credit toward apprenticeship certification and completion? So that's the initial work that Senate Bill 104 will be doing. We're working very closely with our Perkins administrator and the community college system, as well as starting to embed that into some of our local school districts. And then finally, a piece of legislation that we've been working really closely on with CareerWise, it's been driven by CareerWise, is Senate Bill 24-143. So this was one that I'm really excited about. But again, CareerWise has been the driving agent in this piece of legislation, but it's about bringing ISCED to Colorado. So the International Standard Classification System for academic pathways and applied pathways, and trying to create kind of an equivalency across these types of employment, education, and training programs. So that way we can articulate their value in different contexts. Broadly, you know, if someone has an apprenticeship certification, how do we say to an employer that that is equivalent to an associate's or a bachelor's degree? And how do they trust that the competencies that an apprentice has developed are the right fit for their business? And this bill, I think, takes an important step in that direction by trying to say that these types of education and training are comparable, even if they're not traditional. And I think that that's an important first step towards showing young folks that apprenticeship is a viable pathway, and it's a way that you can earn and learn that employers will respond to. So those are a couple of the different policy interventions we're working on. We're working on creating post-secondary pathways through apprenticeship into careers with the state government. But we're really excited to continue our work with dual education and apprenticeship as an alternative pathway into successful careers.
Jess, that was so helpful. And first of all, Colorado is just doing such an amazing job. They're really, I see Seth shaking his head and other panelists too. I think, Seth, that gets to your resources conversation, right? Like it's clear there's the investment behind the work in the state, but I also think the other thing you mentioned that I'm really stood out to me is the dual education piece. I think that's so important. And it's why apprenticeship is such an attractive model, because we're not siloing our education and workforce systems for youth and adults, right? It's a both and. I also think the piece around tax credits and trying to incentivize employers and seeing if that type of intervention helps to get people at the table, especially small and mid-size, will be really exciting to watch. And then again, I think that, Seth, you mentioned blending and braiding resources. And then just to your point around the CTE work you're doing in alignment, it's yes, resources are important, but also, you know, eligibility, accountability models. How are we thinking about these programs, federal or state, run together versus separate? Because it can help enhance the opportunities that we create for young people in our systems. So I'm actually gonna, Jess, you brought up a lot of things that were make my mind turning. So I'm kind of throwing somewhat of a curveball to our speakers right now. So I apologize, but Latifa, Seth, and Vanessa, I want to kind of talk more about this partnership piece, because you all have mentioned in your responses that it takes more than just, you know, one entity to make these types of models successful. And so I really want to kind of hit this home on how you create and sustain high quality youth apprenticeship programs. Who are the necessary partners? Is this work hard? I think we all can say it is. Can you all talk about who the people are that need to be at the table? How do you make those partnerships succeed? And then how do you make the program succeed, working across different partners that speak different languages and want different things out of the model? Vanessa, I'll start with everyst.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Taylor. I think you need everyone at the table. So every partner you can think of should probably have a seat at this table and be somehow connected to the conversation. I'll sort of maybe take my response so Latifa and Seth can weigh in from more of like the community partnership angle. You know, through the work that I do, which is largely with that young adult population that's out of school, it is really, I think, critical that you have as many community partners at the table as you can, right? Because those really are the folks that I think are going to help build that robust wraparound services and supports network. They are folks who can support you with mentoring, often can help bring additional resources to the table. So, you know, for me, that's making sure your workforce development board is engaging with you, that you are working with vocational rehab and your adult education partners, that you are bringing in your chamber of commerce, your economic development agency, for, my rural friends out there, your Rotary Club, your Lions Club, right? Those service partners that we kind of don't think of, that's a great place to get your employers engaged and to start meeting them where they're at. And I think all of those partners can become really essential in getting employers to the table, creating buy-in with employers for this, and then making sure that you're braiding and blending resources, both financial and in terms of wraparound supports that are really going to make sure you have a strong network in place for young people. So they have access to whatever it is that they might need when they're in their program to keep showing up every day, to feel like they belong, and to really kind of understand the value of the experience that they're having. But I'll hold there and let Seth and Latifa weigh in because there's so many partners we could talk about.
Latifa, can I pass to you next?
Sure. And I think, Taylor, you're absolutely right. Like, this is hard work, but it's the right work in order to help our youth and young adults to launch their careers. And developing a high quality youth apprenticeship, echoing what Vanessa shared, it really does require a community approach. So CityWorks DC is an intermediary. And so we work with businesses, we work with schools, nonprofit organizations, higher education. Business partners, of course, are crucial. They're the linchpin. Without them, there is no program. They're the ones hiring our young people. And, for those partners who can see that youth apprenticeship, it really can be a strong talent pipeline for businesses if they're willing to invest and train their talent. This year, we're adding Amazon as one of our business partners. But apprenticeship isn't just for the big companies. Our small local businesses do an amazing job of hiring from the communities in which they're located. And so for those small business owners, we're finding that it's really personal. And so it shows up in the ways that they are committed to the success of our youth. Our community organizations, especially those offering actually internship programs for high school students, have been phenomenal partners. The students in their programs have had experience in industry, and they know already kind of what it takes to be successful in the workplace. And so those partnerships are valuable in that they can provide, and refer great candidates for our CareerWise DC Youth Apprenticeship Program. Similarly, our school partners, they have been our greatest source of youth apprenticeship applicants. We've built trusted relationships. There has to be trust there. And with our school partners, that's even more so because they're allowing us to come into their school buildings. They're enabling us to have classroom information sessions and career fairs and putting us in their school newsletters and other school events. And so we've also partnered with training providers and higher education partners because we need them to provide the related and technical instruction, for our apprentices, particularly in the areas of IT and finance. And so youth apprenticeship really does take a community deciding to come together to build a career pathway for our young people and a talent pipeline for businesses.
Latifa and Vanessa, that was so well said. Seth, anything to add on partnerships and how you kind of create sustainable partnerships in your region?
I don't know what I can add after those two. But what's left? The only other thing that I guess I would highlight is, we do a lot of work also with our municipal leaders, so our mayors, our local elected officials, that sort of thing, because they're also part of it and they are also making other investments into the community. And so one of the other strategies that we've been working on or building momentum on is working with some of those entities, because then when they're making their investments, like the city of Madison now hosts a variety of youth apprentices. Our county now has brought that into their works and now they're investing. So instead of just doing their traditional seasonal hiring, they're shifting that to trying to and focusing on how do we invest in our youth for our summer jobs rather than them just being summer jobs. Let's make these more intentional and sustainable and more than just a summer engagement for them. So we've seen some progression there. We even had the State Department of Workforce Development hosted a youth a youth apprentice in their IT department. So it was interesting to put that back, they're trying to also walk the talk.
Seth, I think that's actually a really great addition because it's really important to have government on the side of innovation and advancement in some of these models. And I actually think that's a perfect segue to my next question. I know we also have a question in the chat, and Vanessa, I thought of you because it's about AmeriCorps. So we hopefully we'll get to that next, but also Vanessa, want you to feel free to weigh in the chat as well. So going to our favorite topic, saying that with sarcasm, politics. We, Jess, want you to weigh in here first, but then obviously, Latifah, not only are you doing work in DC, but also Maryland, and you've worked on this across administrations and across parties, and I would love to hear kind of both of your thoughts on this. While other issues remain deeply partisan right now, workforce development seems like an area of compromise and bipartisan agreement. But sometimes I also think because there is that agreement, there's not always like the motivation or urgency to get something accomplished at the state and federal level. So how can you speak to some of the politics around youth apprenticeship and workforce development in Colorado, Jess? How is the governor talking about this issue to make sure leaders and communities on both sides of the aisle are bought in and understand the impact, but also that are motivated to see this change today versus 5 to 10 years down the road when it might be too late to really impact systems change? And then Latifah, would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I'll say a common refrain in Colorado is that there are 2 jobs for every unemployed Coloradan. And the labor shortage that we're experiencing in Colorado and really across the nation, I think has put renewed focus on workforce development. And I don't want to say I appreciate the labor shortage, but I appreciate that it's creating space for conversations about, are our systems really serving everyone that we're asking them to serve, whether that's the student, the earner, the learner, the employer, the community. And I think what we found in looking at that 2 jobs for every unemployed Coloradan is that the numbers bring people together who might fall across the political spectrum. So for example, our state's labor force participation rate is 68%. But we know that for 16 to 24-year-olds, that labor force participation rate is around 60%, right? There are demographics in Colorado that are or under engaged in our labor force, and that is creating some of the shortage. And then the question then becomes why? Why are they not participating, and how do we better reach them and serve them? We know, again, looking at our labor force participation rates, that we are 10%, 12% lower rates of participation for folks with a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma. And when we think about the talent shortages that we're experiencing, those are target populations, right? Like, how do we connect the folks that aren't participating into our economy? And how do we create pathways that actually work for those students? Because right now in Colorado, fewer than 50% of Colorado students go to post-secondary education and complete. We know that our traditional pathways aren't enough. How do we build pathways that are still of value? And I think making this a values-driven conversation has allowed us to get around politics. I do think Colorado uniquely benefits from a very collaborative ecosystem, all things being considered. I think that something about the West leads people to roll up their sleeves and want to, do it together. But I think that the numbers don't lie. The talent shortages are forcing us to have challenging conversations. And we know that we're not serving everyone. The data shows it. And so having a values-driven conversation about, are we funding what our priorities are? Are we creating access and opportunities to tap into our economy? How do we make sure that regardless of which pathway you choose, you leave with skills and not just a piece of paper? Those are conversations that have allowed this to transcend politics, because it's really about, opportunity. And people love having a conversation about creating opportunity. So I think that helps. I also think that CareerWise, again, a really big agent of change in Colorado, has done a wonderful job of curating this conversation over a decade with different change makers in Colorado. And because they pulled so many different conversation or people into this conversation over such a long period of time, people are familiar with apprenticeship. People in Colorado, regardless of their political background or their orientation to the issue, know that this is a model that is proven in other states. And it's definitely piqued folks' interest to invest in this. And I don't think we would have had such a successful legislative session had those early connections not been so thoughtfully developed.
Jess, I think that's on both examples you shared. I mean, I love your point, like numbers don't lie, and leveraging and using the data we have today on our workforce, on the changes we're expected to see in our labor market, and how that can actually bring people together rather than further separate, especially politically on these issues that are so important to solving some of those challenges. So that's super helpful. Latifa, can I pass to you to share your experience in Maryland?
Sure. I would say, well, one, going back to what Vanessa mentioned earlier in terms of there's just unprecedented interest at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, to really provide more access to a registered apprenticeship at large, but also youth apprenticeship in particular. And what we've seen is it doesn't really matter what side of the aisle that you're on. As just mentioned, like apprenticeship really speaks to our values. It speaks to our values of providing access and opportunity to earn a living wage, so that our young people can be able to provide for themselves and for their families if they choose to have one. And so I think one of the areas that we've seen success, particularly in Maryland, is leveraging the legislative process. So having a leader, having a governor that has made it very clear what his priorities are in terms of the number of registered apprenticeships that he wants to see, the expansion of youth apprenticeship, the fact that there is a requirement in Maryland now that 45% of high school graduates complete the high school portion of a registered apprenticeship by the time they graduate is groundbreaking. And so it's causing all of the actors to come together to work for the benefit of our young people. So you have business and industry and higher education and K-12 and government trying to forge this path forward to make sure that our young people have high quality experiences that, as just mentioned, like just aren't a piece of paper, but really speak to the fact that they have demonstrated and mastered a particular occupation so that they can be marketable, so that they can be employable, and really to drive the economy in the state. But I would say while apprenticeship is bipartisan, I think still as individuals and as communities, we still have preconceived notions about apprenticeship. Too many apprenticeship to many people, like apprenticeship is still the picture of construction, right? While at CityWorks DC, we have apprentices working in IT, in healthcare, in finance, in business. Again, I think when you hear apprenticeship, folks often think about perhaps, a white male, typically in their late 20s, who are getting started. And so we're really trying to change how people understand and how they view apprenticeship. This isn't that other thing. This isn't the thing that you do if you're not able to go to college. It is a multiplier. This is an opportunity to advance your career, and everyone should have access to it. And so we're trying to help rewrite essentially the story about apprenticeship, particularly as we talk about trying to engage more young people and more communities and more families in the story of apprenticeship and getting them connected to work.
Latifa, that is such a great point. I know question, we can think about politics all the time, but actually it's not just politics that are a barrier. And maybe that's not even the barrier on this issue. It's actually changing people's mindset about the value here, and what they see and who they see in apprenticeship. So I thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that's such a great point. Seth and Vanessa, anything you'd want to add on this question before moving forward?
The only thing that I would add is I think the point was spot on about recognizing and that it's more than just the trades. In Wisconsin, we actually just, like last month, our largest single employer of apprentices is in healthcare, which raised a lot of eyebrows, I can tell you, in Wisconsin when that number came. But they have, we have some that have just dove in, and it's definitely changing the perception of where you can go and where apprenticeship can take you.
Yeah, I'll just add real quickly if I can, Taylor. I think this is one of the things that makes youth apprenticeship so important, right? Because youth apprenticeship really is designed to bring education and workforce together. And that means that we have our education friends and partners at the table to see firsthand how valuable and important youth apprenticeship is. And that's important in building this culture around apprenticeship as an equally valuable, equally worthy pathway, right? We need our teachers and our counselors and our folks in education to think about apprenticeship the way the workforce system thinks about apprenticeship. And I think one of the best ways to do that is by having an opportunity to collaborate and do this work in partnership. And that sort of helps to, I think, build a new culture of thinking around what apprenticeship can look like and mean.
I think that's such a great point. And I think, again, I didn't even ask you all, but you're setting me up so well for the next questions. And even from a great question that we got in the chat, which I think really aligns with where we're going in the conversation. Everything you all have talked about today is so impressive. The programs happening in Madison, in the DMV area, also just across the state of Colorado, and Vanessa, the work you're doing across the country to really build these opportunities for more young people. But Jeff, your data was spot on. And we see that not just in Colorado, but elsewhere, the numbers are still really small of people having access to these opportunities. So how can we replicate these successes we're talking about today? And how can we see real scale so more young Americans have access to these high quality learning experiences to set them up for success in their lifetime? And I want to weave in David's question from the chat, which I think, because this question really, I think, is more focused on policy. Like, what are the policy levers we need to be thinking about? And David, I loved your question on how do states' K-12 academic standards either foster or inhibit youth apprenticeships? So while you all are thinking about some of the policy things that states or federal leaders could use, kind of, if anyone has anything on that too, I think that would be great. Does anyone want to start? Jess, perfect.
I'll jump in. Yeah. We had a really exciting piece of legislation a few years ago, House Bill 22-1215, which created a task force directing Colorado to reevaluate our programs in what we're calling the Big Blur space. So shout out to Jobs for the Future in the Big Blur Challenge about how do we blend our K-12 higher education and workforce systems in a way that allow learners and earners to flow in and out at different stages or chapters of their lives. So inspired by that work, this task force basically analyzed all of the programs that we have in our state, whether it's CTE, concurrent and dual enrollment, post-secondary workforce readiness, internships, the whole statewide offerings that we have for our young folks. We tried to understand where we could provide greater access and how we could make these systems more efficient and accessible. And that work has seeded a conversation about youth apprenticeship, and I think a really new way. We're trying to figure out how we can streamline the administration of these programs and the funding of these programs and put them all under one big umbrella. And how do we allow then our school districts to choose from a menu of options that all have similar reporting, similar funding, but allow them to tailor make their post-secondary workforce readiness program offerings? And I would say that the work is still early. House Bill 1364 is this year's next iteration of that work, which will set up statewide longitudinal data system and allow us to do cost modeling for all of these post-secondary workforce programs, whether it's P-TECH, concurrent and dual enrollment, the career development incentive program list. But we're trying to figure out, how do we fund programs that we know work? How do we make sure that those programs connect into opportunities post-secondary? And to the question in the chat about how do education standards support or limit the development of youth apprenticeship, I would say that we're a local control state. So we have to really prove to our local school districts that this is a model that is valuable to them and to their students. And I think once we can do that, and once we can make the funding and the administration more approachable for youth apprenticeships, whether that's through CTE partnerships or our qualified intermediaries, but school districts need help to be able to offer these programs. They're not necessarily the easiest program to put forward when your teachers are already at their full capacity. So making sure that they have help, they have funding, it's reliable, it's consistent, we have technical assistance, the community is willing to support them in this work. That's how we scale, and that's how we show more local school districts and local education providers that this is worth their time.
Latifa, can I pass to you next? I know you respond in the chat.
I did, because I just feel like it's really bringing all the actors together, right? So as Jessica was talking about, how do you get higher education as well as government, whether it's your labor system, your K-12 system, and others, to really have a joint vision for apprenticeship for your state, because that'll show up in your legislative priorities, right, that just shared. That will show up in your accountability measures, like what gets measured gets done, right? So do you have an accountability metric around participation in youth apprenticeship? It shows up in how you develop your graduation requirements in terms of, do you value and do you believe that young people going to work is a valid way to learn? And so that there's all these different parts and pieces that must come together for you to have a coherent system and an ecosystem that supports youth apprenticeship. And so that system can either help to promote youth apprenticeship in your state, as we heard in Wisconsin and in Colorado and others, is what we're seeing in Maryland as they're developing all the legislative frameworks to move youth apprenticeship forward in the state, bringing again together labor, bringing together business, industry, higher education, and K-12. So it's possible and it's doable, but it can also be the inverse, right? You can also see state policy and legislation that is moving young people further and further away from being able to have access to opportunities like youth apprenticeship. It requires a mindset change. It requires a mindset shift that college is not the only way to career, right? At the end of the day, we're all in a career, whether you go college, whether you go to apprenticeship, whether you do both, all roads lead to a career. And so we want to make sure that we're providing as many paths and as many opportunities to our young people to get to the career that they're most interested in. And I think your question, I guess, Taylor, around, what can states do or what can the federal government do? And so I would say first, it's a call to action. There's a call to action to your state leadership to say, hey, make this a priority, make this a part of your platform, and then do all of the things, create all the systems and structures to support that priority. And, for our federal government, continue to move the work forward of bringing together education and workforce. As you were sharing earlier, Taylor, kind of your experience at the Urban Institute yesterday. On Monday, I was at the U.S. Department of Labor celebrating youth apprenticeship. And what was great to see was there was also a representative from the U.S. Department of Education at the event, again, talking about the partnership between the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of Labor. And so how can we see more opportunities at the federal and at the state level that brings these two entities together and kind of break down the silos? You need both, and you need them all to be able to move the work of youth apprenticeship forward.
Vanessa and Seth.
So the one thing that I guess is an opportunity in Wisconsin, we have an interesting statute that does allow for youth to work in what are traditionally prohibited occupations. They have to be in a learner status, and so that's defined in the statute, but it does make youth apprenticeship a bit more approachable for some industries that traditionally walk away. An example is we have a metal forge that is able to host youth apprentices. Traditionally, not on the table for them. So, there are some of those sorts of examples that are also out there that states can look at about how do we make this more approachable? It opens the door to a conversation to those who maybe would back away and say, no, this isn't for us. The other element is, we often get insurance as another challenge, but, we kind of push that envelope with the insurance, insurance companies work for the business, not the other way around. But you need something to also be able to open some of these doors to the businesses to have those conversations, to be able to open up to their careers and have it be an asset to them as well.
So helpful, Seth. Vanessa.
Yeah. So I think from a policy perspective, I would love to see the National Apprenticeship Act get moved. I think that would be great. And if we could use that as a vehicle nationally to codify all the great work happening in youth apprenticeship, I think that would be fantastic. I also think, we're talking about sustaining and scaling these programs. I think funding is going to be really critical, and Jess said it really well, right? We need consistent funding. I also think we have a moment, an opportunity to maybe think intentionally about how we structure our funding moving forward, so that while it is really important that we're focused on creating and expanding programs and enrolling participants, I think investing capacity and resources to follow those apprentices and to support them while they're in their training, to understand their experiences, Do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they feel supported? Do they have access to the resources they need? That's going to help us continually improve and grow what we already have. And I also think within that, really thinking about how we are more flexible and intentional in getting investments to communities that have long been underrepresented in our apprenticeship funding. So thinking of our rural communities, Indigenous communities, communities made up primarily of micro and small employers, right? And thinking about how these resources support responsiveness and flexibility so that everyone really can take part in this system and we can create more opportunities for more young people to benefit from. I'll pause there because I know we have another question we're trying to get to.
No, you all are wonderful. That was really helpful, and I think gave some really exciting insights on some policy ideas for the future. I also will just say, put just a question in the chat. I know we're almost at time, but speakers, I think that's a really great question just on some of the day-to-day on how these programs look. That might be helpful as well. Last minute, rapid fire. So please keep your answers to 10 seconds or less if possible. One thing you didn't get out today that you want this audience to hear and know. Seth, I'll start with you. Sorry, putting you on the spot.
Oh, it's all right. I just think this is a proactive strategy that we got to continue to push the envelope and the message on. I would much rather, make these investments as opposed to dealing with those that have been disenfranchised and we're trying to recoup them out of incarceration and everything else later. So this is an upstream, forward, proactive approach, and we just got to keep pushing.
Great. Latifa.
I'm just excited. I'm excited about the momentum of youth apprenticeship that is sweeping the nation. I'm excited that, you have here examples of different states across the country. You have examples at the federal level. You have examples of what's possible. And so I would just encourage those wherever you are to try to figure out how to make youth apprenticeship work in your local community and in your local context. It is possible, and it provides our young people with the things that they need, with access to professionals, with access to high quality training. It provides them access to education in a way that they haven't had opportunities before. So just thank you so much for the time.
That's wonderful. Vanessa.
Yeah, I'll make a big call to philanthropy. I think if you're looking for something to invest in, youth apprenticeship, I think, is a great way to move the needle on a lot of the causes that are important to you. And then the other thing I'll just say to anybody listening in that is interested in getting started, be patient, be kind to yourself. Apprenticeship it can take a minute to do this work, but there are tons of partners and resources and tools out there to support you in doing this work. And so I think to Latifa's point, find out how to make it work for you and know that you're not alone in doing this.
Vanessa, I think that was a great way to end because I know we just got a question about how it varies state by state, and a certain state, for example, Michigan was mentioned, like how do you get it started? So I think that's just a good kind of advice as people are really trying to ramp this work up. Jess, final thoughts today?
Yeah, I think youth apprenticeship is wonderful, but if we actually want to move the conversation about youth apprenticeship forward, we need to be thinking bigger than youth apprenticeship. We need to be thinking about our education and workforce systems more broadly. And I would just invite, as people take conversations about youth apprenticeship home and into their communities, that they tie the conversation to, talking about skills and competencies over degree attainment, talking about permeable systems, and how do we value experiential learning just as much as we value academic learning. So I think that until we have those conversations and create a system that allows for us to validate and verify and value these kinds of experiences, we won't see a growth in youth apprenticeship. We need all of this to happen together to really build programs that deliver for our students.
I love that, Jess. And I think that's so true. This is like a systems reform conversation, right? While we're talking about one model today, which we know is promising and exciting, it's really thinking big about how we can transform our education and workforce system. So great way to end. I know we had a few last questions and we're at time, so I'm so sorry we didn't get to them, but we will be sharing this recording around, and I think some people are leaving their contact in the chat. So please feel free to reach out to any of us that are on the webinar today. And thank you so much to our wonderful speakers for joining us and for our wonderful audience. Thanks all.